Hiya! So it's time once again for a short history video. And this week we're going to be looking at Ewe Mangweke, Behkecheke, Nehe Katakyamononake. Our relatives, strangers, and our enemies, the Myaamia and our neighbors, during the first era of our history, from emergence to 1640, about the time that disruptions from Europeans start making their way through the lower Great Lakes. So just to remember and reflect, we have these 5 eras of history. And for this week and into the beginning of next, we'll be looking at we'll continue to look at this first era of our history, from emergence to 1640. During this week's lecture, we're going to be looking at the relationships between Myaamia people in the Wabash River Valley and our neighbors, both near and far, and groups that lived even more distantly that we considered enemies. And then groups that we had very little contact with in this period of time that were considered strangers. So they were neither relatives nor enemies. So last week we looked at how the people that came to be called Myaamia or Miami settled the Wabash River Valley. You're looking here at this map with the red oval of our heartlands. And we talked about that these were relatively autonomous, independent villages. Most of them, again, concentrated in that red oval with a few outside of it. And we asked the question and then discussed various kinds of answers. If all of these villages were autonomous, then what held them together? What gave them a shared identity? And that identity eventually got given the name Myaamia. But before that, the identity was Mitosenia, just the people. And there are a lot of really good hypotheses posed in the Canvas site as well as in the class. And we, most in depth talked about that a shared language was something all of these villages held in common and made them different or unique from their neighbors. And then they had shared cultural practices. They followed the same or a very similar lunar calendar. They ate the same foods, farmed, harvested, hunted in relatively the same manners. And they told the same stories, both the same or very similar historical stories and the same or very similar winter stories. And then, like we saw in the story of Kapia, they continued to move in between all of these villages and continued to intermarry, so that they descended from each other in terms of settling the Wabash River Valley, and then they continued to intermix and intermarry and maintain those connections of kinship. And so in many ways, these villages up and down the Wabash saw themselves as a part of a big family, and they literally articulated their relationships in terms of family, and oftentimes referred to each other as siblings, as a part of an extended family group. Usually with older siblings being on the northeastern end of the Wabash River Valley, and the younger siblings being downstream, heading towards what is today Lafayette, Indiana. Today we're going to expand that gaze from the Myaamia family on the Wabash River Valley to look at other more distantly related groups beyond the Wabash River Valley. Some of them speaking similar or related languages, and some of them speaking languages that are extremely different from Myaamia Tawenge. In that, we're going to be looking at the way in which relationships were structured with groups that we still considered a part of an extended family, Ewe Mangweke, those who are our relatives. But we're also going to be looking at those that were our enemies, Katakyamononake, those who were not relatives. And also looking at a third group that's kind of in a in-between status, Pehkecheke, those that were strangers, and therefore neither family nor enemy. So we're going to start this week by looking at Ewe Mangweke, those we have as relatives. And we're going to start looking at the people, beginning with the people we talked about last week, who today are a part of the Peoria tribe of Oklahoma, but were originally considered a part of this extended Myaamia family in the Wabash River Valley. And that's the Wyatanwa and the Peangishia, the Wea and the Piankashaw, who had their villages in the southwestern end of the Wabash River Valley, or at least the southwestern end of our heartlands in the Wabash River Valley. And these two groups were considered younger siblings in the relationship. We have them as younger siblings. And this is explicitly attested to in Trowbridge, and seems to be borne out by the early historical record outside of this period of time, from the period of emergence to 1640. So while today they're not a part of our tribal nation, originally they were a part of that close kinship group. They were considered younger siblings, and were represented as such, for example, at the treaty table in the historic period. Beyond the Wyatanwa and Piankashaw, to the west of the Wabash River Valley in what is today the state of Illinois, we had a familial relationship, a relationship of family with the Anoka, or a group that oftentimes gets called the Illinois in the historical record. And most specifically, the Pewalia and the Kahkahkia, the Peoria and the Kaskaskia. And again, we called them younger siblings. We have them as younger siblings. The historical record isn't completely clear. Some sources say that the Kaskaskia and the Peoria are sort of an extension of that settlement of the Wabash River Valley, that they in fact descend from Miami people. And other sources say that the Kahkahkia and Trowbridge, who interviewed Myaamia people in 1824, he said that he was told that the Kahkahkia, the Kaskaskia, were originally from another group, but they became incorporated into Miami communities and adopted the Miami language, and then they moved west, and that the Peoria descend from the Kahkahkia. And so if you think of it in terms of genetics or descent, they don't concretely descend from Miami people. They were sort of absorbed into the community from outside, but they became culturally similar in terms of language and all the other attributes of culture, and they became a part of the close kin group before they moved west into what became the state of Illinois. So there's differing viewpoints about relationship. Oftentimes a Euro-American attitude about relationship requires there to be a biological or genetic connection to be considered really family. But I think it's fair to say that in this period of time before 1640, biology was not the key determiner of relationship. Sharing these other attributes in common, language, culture, and history, that's what made people close family. Now, over time, once they moved west, you start to get sort of a parting of the streams, and the languages develop differences of accent, so that they speak the exact same language as the people in the Wabash River Valley, but you can think of it like Northern and Southern English. They develop slightly different terminology and a different pronunciation, and Kim Wanisia, Daryl can talk about this more specifically in class, but there's actually some slight consonant shifts where they pronounce consonants differently among the Anoka, the Pewalia and Kahkahkia than among the Myaamia. But the languages were completely intelligible. They could understand each other perfectly. And that's just perhaps a parallel to the differences in culture and the separation from being close kin, maybe when, if we believe Trowbridge's story of the Kahkahkia living in the Wabash River Valley, to being a little bit more distant siblings by the time they're living out west. Looking at this map of language groups before 1640, it's really important to emphasize that what we're looking at here is North America. We're not looking at the United States. We're not looking at Indiana, Illinois, or Ohio. We're not looking at state boundaries. These these hypothetical language groupings that I've mapped out here, They don't follow state boundaries, except where the states are naturally formed by, the boundaries are naturally formed by water. And it's important to remember that our ancestors' lives were not defined by the boundaries, the political boundaries that govern our lives today. It's easy to be ahistorical and think about the United States and its boundaries as somehow meaningful in the distant past, and they simply aren't. They aren't in operation here. So we look at other groups that are related. We can see here to the north, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, people that we considered elder brothers, Sains in Mangwike, and they speak a related language, but it's much more distantly related than Sauk, Meskwaki, and Kickapoo, for example, which is a much more closely related language. And you can see the Sauk, Meskwaki, and Kickapoo to our north here in what eventually became the state of Michigan. Other related groups were the Shawnee, who we also called elder brothers. You can see the Shawnee, Ives Goddard hypothesizes, lived in Ohio before contact with Europeans. The Wyandot were also considered elder brothers who lived nearby. They spoke a completely unrelated language, an Iroquoian-based language, so it has no similarities with Myaamia Neighbors at all. The Shawnee, for example, speak a related language, but it's fairly distantly related, not as intelligible, not as understandable as Sauk, Meskwaki, and Kickapoo. And then another group that we have a long history with, although on this map they're depicted, living quite distant from us, are the Delaware, who we considered grandfathers. We have them as grandfathers. And eventually the Delaware came to live very nearby us on the White River in what became the state of Indiana. But we shouldn't think that our relationship with them is only from the historic period. We know that Myaamia people traveled throughout this entire landscape. As soon as Europeans arrive, they find Myaamia people traveling throughout this space, up into Wisconsin, up into what is today Canada, and on the eastern seaboard in what is today Virginia. And we know from other stories that Myaamia people traveled south to Cherokee country in what is today Georgia. So, we have no documentary evidence of this, but it's quite likely that Myaamia people visited with our grandfathers, the Delaware, on the eastern seaboard at various points throughout our history. So they were not unknown to us when they moved west and into Indiana in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Yes, I forgot to mention, with the Sauk, Meskwaki, and Kickapoo, we don't know for sure what familial relationship, if any, Myaamia people used with this group. We think that they fell into the category of elder brothers, but we also see from the historical record that sometimes Miamis represented the Kickapoo at treaty negotiations, and in doing so we may have been acting as elder brother on behalf of the Kickapoo in that particular scenario, but we don't know for sure. And we do know from the story of Kapia that despite most of our relationships with these related tribes being defined by peace, except for a few aberrant moments, we know from the story of Kapia that there is this historical moment of violence among Myaamia people living in the Wabash River Valley and Kickapoo people who are also living in the southern Wabash and into the Illinois River Valley and Mississippi River Valley in what became the state of Illinois. So, the story of Kapia provides a really good example of how, while these relationships with our relatives, Ewe Mangwike, is usually throughout our history defined in terms of peace, sometimes that broke down and there was violence among these groups. But that certainly was the exception and not the rule. So there's two other categories of relationships outside of Ewe Mangweke, outside of those who we had as relatives, or elder brothers and younger siblings and grandfathers. And the first of those two categories outside of family is Pehkecheke, strangers, those who we did not have a lot of knowledge of upon meeting them, or even meeting them multiple times over history. And this would be a group, for example, like the old moccasins that we read about and heard about in the coming out story. It's a group that spoke the same language as us, so that's recognized. They speak the same language, but that we didn't know where they came from, and we don't know where they went. We don't know who they are, and so they remain strangers to us. They're neither enemies nor relatives. Probably closer to relatives because we could communicate with them, and because they spoke the same language as us. They probably shared similar cultural attributes, but not knowing where they came from, not knowing where they went, kind of leaves them in this amorphous category of pehkecheke, strangers. Other groups that would have been considered strangers to our people, but that stories might have come back to the community through travels regarding these people, are groups like the Blackfeet out west in the Rocky Mountains. The Kickapoo may have visited with them and brought stories back of them, and so we would have known something about them, but they would have been considered strangers, neither relatives nor enemies. Groups like the Dene or Navajo, and groups like the Modoc, who eventually became our neighbors in Oklahoma, from California and Oregon. They're unknown to us, so they're neither enemy nor family. They're strangers. And when we get to talking about after 1640 encounters with Europeans, we have to keep in mind that Europeans were not arriving at first as a known entity. So they entered North America as strangers, people to be wary of, people to be careful of, but not necessarily people that automatically became enemies. They held the possibility of becoming family. So the status of pehkecheke, of strangers, was one that had some layers of danger to it, because they're people that could be enemies, could harm you, but also potential, in that these are people you could develop a relationship of family with, of exchange and gift giving, and what would eventually look like trade. So it's neither negative nor positive, but it certainly has this category of pehkecheke had risk associated with it. And the last category of relationship that we're going to talk about today, Kitakyaamononake, our enemies. Typically, across the breadth of our history, we had enemies throughout that history, as far as we can tell, but that those enemies seem to have always been distant from us. So reaching them, if we were going to, for instance, attack them, would take multiple days of journeying. And the reverse would then also be true. For them to reach us would take multiple days of travel. And so those who lived around us, who are close to us, our close neighbors, were usually ewe mangweke. We usually had them as relatives. And when we had enemies, Kitakyaamononake, they were usually distant from us. And so in Trowbridge, for example, in the 1820s, Pinjewa, John Baptiste Richardville told Trowbridge that the group that we fought with the longest were the Cherokee. And we have stories even in our own language of fighting with the Cherokee. And in fact, in Trowbridge, there's a story about how the peoples living in the east came to call the Miamis Twaitwi, or Tue. And it was that story comes from the Cherokee, who had tried to make an attack on the Miamis, and that some Chechakwa, some sandhill cranes, took off in the midst of that battle, and kind of disrupted the battle for the Cherokees, and led to their defeat. And that the Cherokees believed that some of our people had the ability to transform themselves into Chechakwa, into sandhill cranes. And so then they called us Tue, because that's the sound that the sandhill cranes make. So some of these, and then other people in the east and the south use that same term to refer to us. So the Delaware, for example, are recorded calling the Miami the Tue, and it's quite possible that they got this name from the Iroquois-speaking peoples to their south. We don't know that for sure, though. We don't know how that name moved from the Cherokees to other people. But the Haudenosaunee people, who also fall into the category of Kitak-Yamanonake, also referred to us as Twi-Twi, as well as friendly groups living in the east towards the Atlantic Ocean, like the Delaware, called us Twe-Twe. So the Cherokee are among some of our oldest enemy groups. Other groups in the south, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek, Muskogean-speaking peoples were historic enemies, groups that we traveled some distance to make war on. And then the east, in what would eventually become northern New York, the peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, Mohawk, Cayuga, and eventually Tuscarora were considered a historic enemy group, and we made war on each other for generations. So that again is to the east and slightly to the north. And then in the west, Lakota and Dakota speaking peoples were considered enemies, groups that in English people call the Sioux sometimes, but they refer to themselves as Lakota and Dakota. They were groups typically living on the Mississippi or west of the Mississippi, and they were considered enemy groups, and oftentimes there was back and forth warfare with them. And then southern Siouan-speaking peoples like the Osage, Quapaw, and Kaw, who may have at one time lived on the Ohio River, but at some point moved west into what would become southern Illinois and Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Those groups we also warred with, especially the Osage. We have stories of finding the Osage on the bison hunting grounds in what became Illinois, likely sort of for control of the bison hunting grounds, but that there's a history of warfare there among those groups. So, warfare in this period, when we talk about that, we have to keep in mind that it's not anything like what we imagine either from our contemporary period, or even going back and looking at the wars in the 1780s and 1790s of the Americans. We have sort of large battles and big armies fighting. It wasn't the nature of warfare in the period of time from emergence to 1640. Instead, warfare was a small guerrilla-style fighting. Groups of men, 30 to 50 at the largest in number, traveling some distance to attack an enemy village, usually with the goal of taking captives to bring back to your village, or in some cases, if possible, killing one or two of your enemy, and then very quickly retreating back to your village. Knowing that at some point that community would try a retaliatory attack on your village. So it was kind of back and forth warfare. The goal was not to take control of the village's territory or to force that village to move. The campaign would never have tried, these guerrilla attacks would never try to destroy a whole village or force people into hunger for the winter. The goal was sort of revenge or building esteem by killing esteemed warriors in the enemy community, or taking captives to adopt into your own community to increase your own population, and not really control of territory or the destruction of an enemy community. Those things did happen from time to time, but they were again sort of aberrant moments, unusual moments, and not the rule in combat or in warfare in this first period of our history. So when we look at these three categories, Ewe Mangweke, Pehkecheke, and Kitak-Yamanonake, those we have as relatives, strangers, and our enemies. We also have to remember that these categories were flexible, so that people who were our relatives could sort of become strangers over time, or become enemies for a brief period of time before we work to repair relationships and become family again. And those who were our enemies for long periods of time, those who were considered Kitak-Yamanonake, could through work be transformed into Ewe Mangweke, transformed into relatives. And we have a lot of examples of this from the historic record. The Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, moved into that status of Ewe-Mangwike in a preliminary way around 1701. So this is outside the period we're talking about, but I want to give you a sense of the flexibility. In the early 1700s, they began to transition into Ewe-Mangwike to become a part of a family. And by the middle of the 1700s, they had more fully transitioned to the status of elder brothers, especially the Seneca on the western side of the Confederacy, as they became very well known to us. It helped us in many regards as we tried to adjust with changes that came in the 1700s. And then through our wars with the Americans, in some cases, became very firm allies, both on the battlefield and on the negotiating table, at the negotiating table. And of course, today, the Seneca-Cayuga group in Oklahoma are near neighbors and have very much continued this practice of being elder brothers. So very much a transition from Kitakyaumononake to Ewe-Mangwike, to family, that continues to this day. And the Cherokee, as I said, who are our oldest enemy, began that transition in the early 1800s after the War of 1812, definitely out of the status of enemies. First of all, the war trails to Cherokee country became closed after the War of 1812. It really wasn't possible to make attacks on them anymore. And in fact, their efforts to resist removal and to revitalize their community practices, governance, farming, etc., were viewed as a model by some Myaamia people to try and change our communities after the War of 1812 to be able to survive the increasing levels of European settlement in what became the state of Indiana. So they became friends in that way. Whether they ever formally adopted the status of kinship and became Ewe-Mangwike, we don't have evidence of, but they certainly began to be seen in a very similar light to those that we called elder brothers in the earlier period. And then certainly after removal, first to Kansas and then especially to what became Oklahoma in 1846, the Cherokee were the largest and most influential group in and around what became Ottawa County, so in the part of Indian Territory where our people ended up. And so there was a large intertribal relationship, a large intertribal network built there that operated very much like Ewe-Mangwike, like those we held as family from the earlier period. And again, I have never seen an example of the Cherokee being called elder brother in this period of time, but you can see some moments where they're definitely behaving like elder brothers and we're behaving like younger siblings after the 1840s and especially after the 1870s when we arrive as a nation in Indian Territory. So, it gives you a sense of how these categories are not immutable. They very much are flexible and change over time. And when we look at our relationships in the coming weeks with Europeans, with the arrival of French-speaking peoples, Spanish-speaking peoples, English-speaking peoples, and German-speaking peoples, we're going to see some of the same patterns that, our relationships with them are not set in stone from the very beginning, and the relationships they do get established with Europeans are flexible and change over time, sometimes in dramatic ways. And so the pattern is mirrored in our relationships with Europeans, just like our relationships with the indigenous peoples that lived around us in the period from emergence to 1640. So when we gather together in the summertime through Ewan Zapata to play a lacrosse game against the Seneca-Cayuga there in Oklahoma, we don't talk about having a relationship that stretches back over time, back to the 1700s. But certainly it's kind of in the water between the tribes that we've known of each other for hundreds of years, in some cases even longer than that. And so there's a certain deepness that comes with those kinds of relationships. It's important for us to remember as Myaamia people. These relationships, understanding these three kinds of relationships, also sets the stage, builds the foundation for us to understand how our ancestors tried to make sense of Europeans when they first arrived in North America. But it also helps us understand how our ancestors responded to the stressors that actually preceded the arrival of Europeans in the lower Great Lakes. So before Europeans ever arrived, diseases swept through, and warfare produced by causes on the East Coast, where Europeans had already begun to build settlements, swept through the lower Great Lakes and caused a massive series of changes in our community and other communities. And how we responded to those changes is in part a result of these relationships, so that family is who you turn to help respond to stressors and to survive when things are really difficult, and when you're in your darkest moments. And then, of course, who are your enemies before these changes occur oftentimes drastically affects the choices you can make, because if you're already at war with people, they don't easily, you can't easily transform them into family to meet the disruption that came, for instance, with smallpox. So we'll get more into depth with this when we look at the next era of our history, but having a firm understanding of Ewe Mangueke, Pehkecheke, and Kitakyamononake, those we have as relatives, strangers, and our enemies, is going to be really key to understanding what happens after the 1640s. So until I see you all in class, and until the next history video, Neo Akakokekate, Shaye.